In this video, we're going to talk about the relationship between price elasticity and excise taxes. So before we go on to analyzing this graphically, let's just define what an excise tax even is. So what is an excise tax? So an excise tax is a tax levied on the sale of a particular good. Okay, this is not a formal definition. This is an informal definition. But the idea is that every time a supplier sells a unit of some good, they have to pay some tax to the government. Okay, now let's analyze what changes this tax brings to the model that we've already built, the model of demand and supply. So, before the tax is levied, okay, the consumer pays the equilibrium price, right? For each unit of the good, right? And of course, the supplier receives the equilibrium price. Okay, what do I mean by the consumer pays and the supplier receives? Very simple. You go to the store and or doesn't have to be a store. The consumer purchases one unit of the good and pays price PE. In this situation, there's no government, there are no taxes. So whatever the consumer pays, the supplier gets to keep. Now, let's add in the tax. Okay, so after the tax is added in, right, the consumer still pays the equilibrium price. That doesn't change. Consumer pays the equilibrium price, but now the supplier does receive PE, but only keeps the price minus the tax, right? Because the supplier has to pay that tax to the government. Okay, now, how might that look graphically? Well, let's just remind ourselves what the situation would look like graphically before the imposition of the tax, and then we'll add in the tax afterwards. Okay. We have our supply curve, we have our demand curve, and of course, before the tax is imposed, we have our equilibrium point with its corresponding equilibrium quantity, and of course, its equilibrium price. Okay, so this is the price before the tax is imposed that is paid by the consumer and kept in its entirety by the supplier. Now, the government comes in and imposes a tax. So let's write that down. The government imposes excise tax T. Okay. How will this T be represented? Well, the first thing I would want to argue is that T is going to represent the difference between what the consumer pays and what the supplier actually gets to keep, right? That directly follows from what we wrote up here. The consumer pays PE, and the supplier gets to keep this PE minus T. So there's going to be a gap in our graph, right, between PE on the one hand and PE minus T on the other hand. Now let's make the labels a little bit easier here. Let's call this PE here the consumer price and this PE minus T the supplier price. So PC, the consumer price, is what the consumer has to pay. And PE minus T, or PS, the supplier price, is the amount of money that's actually kept by the supplier. Okay, now, how do we actually figure out what the supplier and consumer prices are? Well, it all stems from the fact that when the government imposes the tax, the supply curve will shift to the left. Why will the supply curve shift to the left? Because for every price, right, for every price along this axis, the supplier is going to get to keep less of it than she would have before. This means that there's less of an incentive to sell whatever the corresponding quantity was before the imposition of the tax. So therefore, for every price, the supplier will want to supply less of the good because the supplier will be getting to keep less of the good, right? So this is simply, in our model, a leftward shift in the supply curve. So S prime is our new supply curve. Okay, what is the new equilibrium point? This here will be our new equilibrium point, right? This will be our new equilibrium quantity, right? And of course, our new equilibrium price is going to be here, but we're going to call it, as we said over here, our consumer price. Okay, we're going to call that PC. Okay, now, to review, the supply curve shifts to the left, and this, of course, causes a decrease in the quantity exchange, which is the whole point of the excise tax in the first place, right? The excise tax is meant to disincentivize the consumption of a certain good that is deemed harmful for whatever reason. Okay, and in a later video, we're actually going to talk about why the government might want to impose an excise tax. But that's not relevant for now. Right now, we're just assuming that the government imposes it. So the government imposes this tax, okay, equilibrium quantity shifts to the left, and equilibrium price, of course, increases, resulting in a new equilibrium price, which we're calling PC, the consumer price. Now, the difference between PC and PS is going to be the amount of the tax, right? Now, let's say that the government, okay, had to accept the following, not the government, sorry. Let's say that the supplier had to accept the following amount of money. PC, right, which is what the consumer pays, minus T. Now, how much would they be willing to supply at this price? Well, we already know how much the supplier is supplying, right? It's the equilibrium quantity. That is the amount that is in fact being supplied. This is the new quantity exchanged, okay? Now let's go up to the supply curve and figure out the corresponding price. What is the corresponding price to that point? The corresponding price is right here. And we're going to call that PC minus T or PS. So let's get this clear here. That's our old equilibrium price. And over here we have PS. Okay, now what does that mean? If PS is simply PC minus T, right, then that must mean that this gap here is T, right? So the gap between the consumer price and the producer price is T. Now, I encourage you to pause the video at this point and actually take a look at this graph and see if you understand it intuitively. If you don't, rewind and review the explanation again. I got here through a step-by-step process by moving the equilibrium point to the left because the supply curve shifted to the left, finding the corresponding price, PC, equilibrium price, and then simply asking myself, how much would the supplier be willing to supply if the price were PC minus T? Well, we already know how much the supplier is supplying. It's QE, right? Or QE prime. QE prime is the quantity exchanged, and therefore that must correspond to the producer price or the amount of money that the producer is allowed to keep, which is simply the consumer price minus T. Okay, and that therefore means that this gap here is this gap right here is T. Okay, if that doesn't make sense, like I said, rewind, go over this again, and try to convince yourself that this is true within our model. Okay, now the question becomes, who bears the burden of this tax? Okay, let's write down this problem like this. So, who bears the burden of the excise tax? Okay, what do I mean by who bears the burden? The question is, who actually pays, or not who pays, who suffers, who suffers from the imposition of this tax? Who loses something as a result of this tax? Is it the supplier or is it the consumer? Now, we said before that the excise tax is actually paid by the supplier to the government. So you might think, well, it's obviously the supplier that loses out. But you'll notice that both the supplier and the consumer actually lose something. Why is that? Well, take a look at this. PC, which is the amount that the consumer has to pay, is higher than what the consumer was previously paying, which is PE. So the consumer is suffering, quote unquote, from the imposition of the tax by having to pay a higher price. Meanwhile, the amount of money that the supplier gets to pocket, PS, is lower than PE. So the supplier also, quote unquote, suffers from the imposition of this tax, right? But who suffers more? Who suffers more? Well, the answer can be obtained by just looking at this graph. Which is bigger? This gap, okay, or this gap? Now, this second gap here is the difference between what the supplier was previously receiving and what he is currently receiving. So this is the supplier's tax burden. And now, of course, on top here, we have the difference between what the consumer is currently paying and what the consumer had to pay before. So this is the consumer's tax burden. Now, who bears the burden of the tax? Okay, this might be confusing phrasing. This just means who pays more of the tax. Well, in this case, we can clearly see that the consumer's gap here is bigger. So in this case, it would be the consumer. Okay, because the difference between PC and PE, right? So another way, so mathematically, PC minus PE is greater than PE minus PS. Okay, so that's why the consumer in this case has to bear the burden of the tax. Now, what does this have to do with elasticity? Okay, I want you to notice something about the supply and the demand curves. It might not be extremely obvious by looking at this picture, okay? But in this case, now, I don't want to get this wrong. The demand curve is steeper. Yeah, that's right. So, the demand curve is steeper than the supply curve in this case. How do I know that? Well, imagine if the supply curve and the demand curve were equally steep. Okay, let's say they made, a perfect 90-degree angle. Okay, that might not be quite perfect. Then, okay, the gap between these 2 points here would be such that this here would be exactly equal to that there. I don't know if you can see that. Maybe let's make that bigger to make it super clear. So I'm going to try to make the demand and supply curves equally steep. Okay, so in this case, if we had, so this is our old equilibrium point, and then we have some gap here, right? And this would be PC, this would be PS, and this would be our tax T. You can see here, just visually, that is very roughly equal to that. And you could imagine the supply curve getting less and less and less steep, right? So if the supply curve started moving that way, right, this gap here would grow, okay? Similarly, if the supply curve got less steep and went that way, the gap here would shrink, okay? So in our case here, we know that the demand curve is steeper because this gap here is bigger, okay? So what have we learned about the relationship between the steepness of the curve and elasticity, right? We've learned that the steeper the curve, the less elastic is either demand or supply. So in our case here, what we essentially have is a situation in which demand, so let's bring this graph down here a second. Okay. So we have a situation here in which demand is inelastic relative to supply. Okay? Another way of putting that is that supply is elastic relative to demand. Okay? The demand curve is steeper, therefore supply is more elastic, and we say that supply is elastic relative to demand. And what have we learned from this situation? The consumer bears the burden of the tax. Okay, I want us to think about this economically, commonsensically, okay? Because looking at the graph, we can see that within our model, this is clearly true, okay? But we should always ask ourselves as economists, why is this true? What is the economic meaning of the fact that if supply is elastic relative to demand, then the consumer bears the burden of the tax? And of course, the opposite would also be true, right? So let's just write that down to be thorough here. If demand is elastic relative to supply, then the supplier bears the burden of the tax. Okay, now, what might this mean from a sort of common sense point of view? Well, if supply is elastic relative to demand, this means that demand is relatively inelastic, which means that demand is relatively insensitive to a change in price. So when the supplier receives the bad news, which is that now he's going to have to pay some tax to the government, he thinks, okay, how can I offload some of that burden? I'm going to raise my prices. I'm going to force the consumer to pay some of that tax. Now, how much can I force the consumer to pay? Well, if consumers' demand is relatively insensitive to a hike in price, then I can offload most of the burden of the tax onto the consumer because the consumer's demand is not that sensitive anyway, right? Whereas if the opposite were true, if demand were relatively sensitive, then of course, as a supplier, I can't offload much of that burden. Why can't I do that? Because if I hike prices too much, consumers are going to flee, and I just simply won't be able to sell as much gas as I otherwise would have been able to sell, and that'll be bad for my profits. The supplier is making a cost-benefit analysis here. They're thinking, okay, how much of the tax, by how much can I actually hike my prices without scaring away so many of my customers that it won't be worth it for me? Okay, and the answer lies in the solution to the question, how elastic is the demand of the supplier? Okay, so this is why elasticity matters for excise taxes, right? If supply is elastic relative to demand, then the consumer bears the burden of the excise tax. If demand is elastic relative to supply, then the supplier bears the burden. Okay? As usual, if you found this video useful, please like it, subscribe to my channel, share the video with friends and classmates, and of course, leave a helpful comment if you have suggestions for further videos. I'll see you next video.